Okay, let's get started. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Curtis for being here. I'm Darin Strauss, and on behalf of NYU, I want to thank everyone for being a part of this. Um, I've been a fan of our guests since her first book, Prep, which makes me only very much like every other literate person in America. But I remember actually my reluctance to it, how I didn't want to like the now classic novel when it came out. A book getting a lot of buzz. I mean, I was having trouble at that point with my second book, I think, and a book getting a lot of buzz about a familiar subject, about prep school, which struck me as the kind of privilege I never cared about or could afford. Well, I guess as a young writer myself, I resented both the buzz and the subject, but then I read the book and it astonished me. In order to be good at this job, one has to develop a literary Geiger counter, catch the tick, tick, tick that betrays the dangerous arrival of brilliance. Technique, feeling, deep verisimilitude, all were scarily present, and my senses, thank goodness, were still fresh enough to recognize a masterwork. For my money, the brave and prickly Lee Fiora should replace Holden Caulfield as the high school character who best shows what it's like to be young and out of touch with one's own life. Since that wondrous debut, Curtis has shown herself a writer of great range. Maybe because the books all seem so perfectly natural, because as Matthew Arnold said about Tolstoy, books like hers seem so real that they read somehow not as a work of art, but a piece of life. People have missed the great range of her stuff, and the brave experimentalism therein too. She's written since Prep, a coming of age novel, a reimagining of the life of one of our most reviled president's wives, a kind of fantasia about twins with supernatural powers, a brilliant and idiosyncratic retelling of Pride and Prejudice set in Cincinnati, a book of stories, and a portrait of Hillary Rodham Clinton in an alternate universe where she never picked up the last name Clinton. Before I get briefly to the new book, and no one's here to listen to me go on about this, so I'll be quick. But before I get to the new book, I want to stop for a second on Curtis's under-admired skill as a writer of short literary fiction. All of the stories of hers I've read are amazing, but there's one called Gender Studies that has stayed with me in the 5 years since it came out. Stayed with me as has almost no other work of fiction of the period. In that story, Sittenfeld, with sensitivity that isn't soft-headedness, with impartiality that isn't overly forgiving, explains the problem of Trumpism better than 1,000 op-eds before or since. And then, of course, there's Rodham, the new book, a work of profound empathy and imagination, a portrait that's kind but not an act of hero worship. I mentioned Tolstoy before. Isaac Babel once said, if the world could write by itself, it would write like Tolstoy. I think that's true of very few contemporary writers, or very few writers in general. But Sittenfeld is one of them. You don't sense a writer making decisions, good or bad, with her. You sense the world as it is in the way it just kind of has to be. Somehow her books seem to go beyond artifice into pure reality. Also, like War and Peace, Rodham shows that history is determined not by one or two dramatic moments and major shifts of great events, but in that book, on the other hand, as in life, history is made by the sum total of an infinite number of small decisions taken by ordinary people, personal scale incidents that each exert a tiny push and together move the ship of history slowly but without a doubt. Anyway, it's a great book and we're very excited to hear from it tonight. And I think it's one of the few recent books whose popularity is matched by its excellence. So thank you, Curtis, for coming.
Darin, that was like a shockingly kind introduction. We were just, before all of you joined us, we were just making chit chat about all sorts of. I had no idea that that was such a. I already knew that you were a wonderful writer, but I had never heard you write so beautifully about me. And I was like, wait, did he just compare me to Tolstoy? And then I was like, did he just compare me to Tolstoy twice? Like, I think I need a copy of that for my low self-esteem. That was very beautifully written, and it was very generous. And thank you. This is such a joy. I agreed to do this event not knowing that I would get to be in conversation with you, and it was such a delightful bonus to learn that I would. So thank you so much. And I feel like, as I'm sure all the viewers know, Darin's novel, The Queen of Tuesday, is most recent novel, also sort of borrows from real life as mine does. So I thought, oh, we'll definitely have a ton to talk about. I also have to say one quick thing before I actually read, which is, I think the first time we ever met, I think was in 2004, a few months before my first novel came out, and we were on a panel together. And I don't know if this is original to you, but I've quoted something you said like 700 times, which is, you said the period before a writer's book comes out is the calm before the calm. Everyone, like, I never take credit. I always attribute it to you, but everyone always finds it very funny because, of course, as writers, we like to have, all these illusions about our centrality in the culture. And I haven't been, so lucky to have books that in some cases have gotten certainly plenty of attention. And even on those days, it's like on publication day, I've done like 3 loads of laundry and, like walked from my house to, the sidewalk to get the newspaper or whatever.
I really remember that. I remember that panel very well because that was before your book came out. And I remember meeting you and then reading the book and being so blown away by it. And I remember thinking, God, I wish I'd read this book before the panel because I would have asked you all these questions about it.
It didn't exist. Actually, do you know who else? I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Taffy Brodesser actor was like administrating that panel. It was,
I don't remember that part.
It was in Jesse Oxford. It was it was like a media bistro event. Just I know that we're here to reminisce about special times 17 years ago. And I'm really excited for it. Okay, so should I just start?
Please, okay. Yeah.
No, all right, I'm gonna glance at my watch. So this in Rodham, it basically, there are 3 sections, and the first one sort of follows reality and starts in 1970, and Bill Clinton and Hillary Rodham are at Yale Law School, and this is the narrator is Hillary, but you don't really need to know anything else. The first time I saw him, I thought he looked like a lion. He was 6'2", though I knew then only that he was tall. And in fact, his height seemed even greater because he was big tall, not skinny tall. He had broad shoulders and a large head, and his hair was several inches longer than it would be later, which drew attention to its coppery color. His beard was the same shade. I suppose I thought he looked like a handsome lion, but even from a distance, he seemed full of himself in a way that canceled out his handsomeness. He seemed like a person who took up more than his share of oxygen. This sighting took place in Yale Law School's student lounge in the fall of 1970, my second year of law school and his first. I was with my friend Nick, and Bill was speaking in his loud, husky, Southern accented voice to a group of 5 or 6 other students. With great enthusiasm, he declared, "And not only that, we grow the biggest watermelons in the world." Nick and I looked at each other and began laughing. "Who is that?" I whispered. "Bill Clinton," Nick whispered back. "He's from Arkansas, and that's all he ever talks about." The next thing Nick told me was actually at Yale Law School less notable than being from Arkansas. He was a Rhodes Scholar. After I'd been accepted at both Harvard and Yale, I'd decided where to go using a rule I'd established for myself at such an early age, probably in 3rd or 4th grade, that I had trouble remembering a time when I hadn't abided by it. Though I'd never discussed it with anyone, I thought of it as the rule of 2. If I was unsure of a course of action, but could think of 2 reasons for it, I'd do it. If I could think of 2 reasons against it, I wouldn't. Situations arose, of course, where there were 2 or more reasons both for and against something, but they didn't arise that frequently. Should I, as a high school freshman, take Latin? Because I'd heard the teacher was outstanding and because it would help me with the SATs, yes. Should I attend my church youth group's retreat at Gebhard Woods State Park if it meant missing my friend Betty's Sweet 16 party? Because the date of the retreat had been announced first and because a church event was inherently more moral than a party, yes. Should I style my hair in a beehive? Yes. Should I major in history? No. Should I major in political science? Yes. Should I start taking the pill? Yes. After Dr. King's assassination, should I wear a black armband? Yes. That my reasons were often simply articulations of my own preferences wasn't lost on me. But in the privacy of my own head, who cared? The reasons I'd ultimately chosen Yale were, one, its commitment to public service, and two, when I'd attended a party at Harvard Law after my acceptance there, a professor had declared that Harvard didn't need more women. As with Yale, the number of female law students at Harvard was then at about 10%, and I was slightly tempted to enroll just to spite this professor, but only slightly. And then should I keep going or should we start talking? Maybe I'll read like a tiny bit.
I think you keep going if you feel comfortable, but
Okay, I'll read
I'm totally enjoying it.
Okay, I'll read a tiny bit more, like one more page. One evening in March 1971, shortly after spring break, I was studying in the law library, which was in a striking Gothic building. The library occupied a long room filled with carols. Above the bookshelves were large arched stained glass windows and bronze chandeliers hung from the wood ceiling. I'd been sitting at a carol for 90 minutes, and every time I looked up, I made eye contact with Bill Clinton, the lion. He was about 20 feet away, perched on a desk and talking to a man I didn't know. I wondered if Bill was confusing me with someone else. Then again, since only 27 students my year were women, it shouldn't have been that difficult to keep us straight. I stood, approached him, and said, I noticed you looking at me. Is there something you need? I extended my hand. I'm Hillary Rodham. He smiled slowly and broadly, and in his warm, husky Southern voice, he said, I know who you are. Oh, Bill Clinton's smile. More than 45 years have passed since that night in the library, and at times it's crossed my mind that his smile may have ruined my life. He added, you're the one who told off Professor Geeney on Ladies' Day. This, Ladies' Day, was a ritual observed by some professors who called on female students to speak just once a semester on a designated day. But Professor Geeney, who taught corporate taxation, which was an upper level class Bill wasn't in, took the tradition further than most. Every Valentine's Day, the professor started class by announcing that it was Ladies' Day and asking all the virgins to assemble in the front of the room. When he'd done it a few weeks before, I, along with the two other women in the section, stood but remained at our seats as we'd planned to do in advance, and I spoke on our behalf. I said, this is an offensive custom that has no place in an academic setting. The female students present should be treated as full members of the law school community with the same rights to participation in this class as the male students. When I'd finished, I'd felt some of the defiant satisfaction I had at my Wellesley graduation, and the feeling hadn't diminished when Professor Geeney said, fine then, Ms. Rodham, you ladies may stay where you are, but since you seem particularly keen to share your viewpoints today, I'll let you begin our discussion by summarizing Gregory versus Helvering. I'd be happy to, I said. In the law library to Bill Clinton, I said, yes, that was me. Bill rose then from the desk, all 6'2" of him, with his coppery hair and beard, and took my still extended hand. He said, it's a pleasure to officially meet you. I'm Bill. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great, of course. So many questions just from that bit. Ladies' Day, is that true? Did that really happen?
So that is something that would really happen. I don't think that I had come across it in reading about Hillary Clinton. I could be mistaken because my memory is not flawless, but until, there was this Hulu documentary that Hillary executive produced, and it was about her, and it came out just a couple months before the book was published. So I was basically finished with the book, and she, I think, talks about Ladies' Day in that documentary, but I did, you know, various kinds of research for the book. And one thing I did is that I have two friends who are law professors. One is exactly Hillary's age, you know, so graduated from college at the same time, went to Vassar instead of Wellesley, and graduated from law school at the same time. And then the other, and her name is Susan Appleton. And then the other law professor, Rebecca Hollander Blumoff, is she's more like a little bit older than I am. And I had so many questions for both of them in all sorts of ways. But Susan, who's the peer of Hillary, told me about Ladies' Day, which I just, and the minute she told me, I just thought, oh my God, that's so shocking. I have to include it.
So you had that before you saw, obviously before you saw Hillary talk.
Yeah.
Well, that leads to the larger question. When you're writing about someone so famous, but she's also your character, it's both a novel and an examination of this world's, you know, top 5 most famous women, one of the most famous people in the world, one of the most admired people in the world. How do you know what to include from life, what to invent? How do you work that balance?
Which I suspect that those are questions that you have asked yourself in your own writing. And so I'm curious what your answer to this is too. I mean, I think some of it is like trial and error or instinct, or, you know, like in some ways, I think it's, I wanted to include moments that felt very meaningful, or, you know, sort of larger than themselves. I also, as I mentioned before I read, you know, it's sort of like the first third of the book follows reality insofar as, you know, the public record tells us. I still had to make up tons of, you know, dialogue and private moments and everything. And then it really deviates from it. And then it was in the sort of, you know, second third and the third third, it was more like pulling, like almost thinking, what moments make the book have a conversation with reality? But I mean, did you for yourself have a rule, or like, was it kind of just?
I didn't have a rule. No, I mean, yeah.
By the way, I'm sure a lot of people know, but do you want to like give a summary of your book so people understand?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Books are in
my book, it's funny. This was a question I was going to ask too, but I don't know why I did this, but I felt compelled to do this, thinking it was totally out there. So my book is about Lucille Ball and my grandfather. And so it's a weird book in similar ways, I guess, to Rodham, in that it's a biography of Lucille Ball, pretty accurate. And then it's a family memoir of my grandfather, fully accurate. And then their passionate sexual affair, which is totally invented.
You're my kind of person. Anyone who imagines a passionate sexual affair for their grandpa. Like.
No, it's a weird thing. But so when I was writing about Lucille, you know, and this is my question for you, of course, after a while, she stopped becoming the Lucille Ball of the world and she became my character. And so I was going to ask, you know, I will ask, you know, did that happen for you? Or was she always the Hillary we all know? But I would change things. I mean, you know, I've written novels before that loosely touch on real people, but when you're doing something so famous, I think you can't take that many liberties. But I took as many as I could, because I'm sure you feel this way too. The story is what you're responsible to, not the facts. And you want your book to be entertaining and do whatever else literature does besides entertain. So I changed as much as I felt I could without totally pissing people off or, you know, being disrespectful to her. But Hillary, I think, you know, more than Lucille Ball, who was a famous woman from a while ago, everyone knows so much about Hillary. And so that was that constraining, or was that freeing? Because you felt like, I have this woman, I know she's fascinating, so I can stop worrying, did I create an interesting character?
Well, it's a strange thing because, I mean, one, I strongly identify with everything you're saying, but I feel like I even in conversation, if I'm talking about the book, I'll say, well, my Hillary does this, which in some ways sounds affectionate, but I just mean as opposed to real Hillary, your Hillary, like Hillary Clinton versus Hillary Rodham. I mean, I definitely, I would also joke, like, I feel like in order to write the book, I would, put on my metaphorical pantsuit and my blonde wig. And so, it's supposed to be almost inhabiting Hillary at the same time. And I understand that some people think, like, how can you, isn't that against the rules? Or how can you make up stories about a living real person? Um, and I feel like it's so clearly a novel. I've never met Hillary. I would never pretend that I have. And that in a weird way, it's tonally different, but it's not so different from like Kate McKinnon on Saturday Night Live acting as Hillary, where you understand that's Kate McKinnon.
Right.
She's a comedian. She's dressed like Hillary. Some of the things that come out of her mouth, maybe Hillary literally did say, and then others she didn't. But it's like coming at life sideways and highlighting things about, politics or gender by like representing what we think we've seen in reality. So that's how I sort of like would give myself permission. But I also I don't know if you feel this way. Like when I write a novel, it's a little bit of like a fever dream where you're inside the novel, and every day I'm like in my imaginary pantsuit, and enough time has passed. So this book was published in May, that a part of me thinks, oh my God, did I write a novel from from Hillary Clinton's perspective, as if she didn't marry Bill Clinton? And like, did I include sex scenes? And like, like, oh my God, like who did that? Do you feel that way
I
about?
relate to that so much, because whenever I would tell people what I was working on, they'd be like, that is so weird. And I was like, no, that's just what I'm working on. But now I totally feel the same way.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because, so when I this book took me a really long time. So when I came up with it, it was before Trump was president, and because Trump plays a part in the book, his father, because my grandfather actually met Lucille Ball at a party thrown by Trump's father. That's how the book starts. So, but when I started writing it, like Trump was just this New York real estate guy that, I didn't know if anyone would care. But anyways, the reason I bring it up is, so it was years ago I came up with this, like 6 years ago I came up with this idea, or more. And I thought it's very odd, and everyone said it's odd. But then as I was into it, other writers started doing similar things. Like there's your book, and then Martin Amis just came out with a novel that's sort of real people in a fictional setting. And Michael Chabon did a book that is a novel, but it's also about his grandfather. And so besides the two of us, there's Chabon, Amis, Rachel Cusk has
Oh yeah.
that kind of stuff. So I wonder, is there something about this time? Maybe because I was trying to figure out what is the reason that lots of writers are sort of mixing fact and fiction. Maybe I was trying to figure, is it the internet somehow, or like everyone's so invested in everyone's life? Because this is something that never happened, and now there are all these books that are examining this. And what is it that drew you to this story?
I mean, okay, there's I guess there's a few ways to answer that. In the sort of most literal answer, I think there's two things that made me write this, or maybe even three things. One thing was because I had written American Wife, this novel, which is, loosely based on Laura Bush, although the names are changed, which they're not changed in Rodham. And I basically did that for clarity in Rodham, because I felt like I changed the historical record, and so I couldn't like change the names and the historical record, or it would be confused, and it would just seem like a woman of Hillary's generation, but not Hillary. But anyway, so because I had written American Wife, an editor at Esquire magazine reached out and asked if I would like to write a short story from Hillary's perspective around the time of the 2016 election, actually a few months beforehand. And I did. And it was, so I had that experience of writing in the first person, sort of like recollecting my time as Secretary of State, and it followed, like she was married to Bill in that version of things, although it never said her name. So I'd had that experience, sort of prompted externally. Then I also knew that in real life, Bill proposed twice and Hillary said no. And then he proposed a third time and she said yes. And it did make it feel a little bit like, oh, like this wasn't all inevitable, or things could have been a little bit different. I just think those are interesting questions to examine in anyone's life. Like, could things have unfolded very differently if just, and then I think the third thing was that, you and I are both parents, and I realized around the time of the election in 2016 that kids who knew Hillary was running for president, in many cases, literally didn't know Bill Clinton existed. And that was so fascinating. And after the election, and I'm certainly a Democrat, I think I felt like, would the election have turned out differently if adults didn't see Hillary and Bill as so intertwined the way that children don't, and if adults didn't sort of hold her accountable for his behavior. So in terms of why I wrote this specific book, I think it was like this combination of sort of factors. In a larger sense, I mean, I think there are, like, it's an interesting thing if you think about historical fiction, that it seems like no one bats an eye if a novelist writes about someone who's dead, and the longer the person has been dead, the less an eye is batted. And like, why is that? Like, I mean, I guess it's like legally even more permissible or something, because libel doesn't apply to the dead, but and so I think it does happen. But then I also think that you're onto something in terms of like social media, and I don't know, like we live in what feels like a very weird, very dramatic moment, where we're like trying to make sense of our lives, and maybe reading, like, I was talking a little bit to the MFA students at NYU earlier today, and sort of talking about short stories, and also like in TV, it seems like sometimes crazy things will happen in like the pilot episode of a TV show. And it's like, do you think novelists are having the same kind of like cultural reactivity, where it feels like, like crazier things happen than or like we're all pushing the limits, we're all influencing each other? I don't know, actually.
Yeah, or maybe life seems less real somehow, or more written down because we're all writing social media. So then like they're making life half narrative, half real. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm still not sure either, but I thought it was interesting that, we both were doing this, and then a bunch of other people were doing it. It's so interesting too that it was a writing prompt for a novel. I had never heard that before, that an editor was like, hey, try this. And then you actually wrote a great novel based on it. That's really...
Well, so it was he assigned me to write a short story.
Sure.
And I should say, like, I think if Hillary had won the election or had become president, I don't think I would have written the novel. But so like, let's say the editor reached out to me in, like February 2016, and a full year passed before I decided to write the novel. So I wasn't like, oh, I want to live in this world a little longer. I think in some ways it was, as a Democrat, I mean, even though I understood that I could not literally rewrite the outcome of the 2016 election, I could sort of artistically rewrite it, or like live in a different mental space for a few years.
Well, that's another question. How did you not make it, I don't know how to pronounce this word, I only see it written hagiography.
I don't know either. We must be writers if we don't know how to pronounce words, but we know what they mean.
We know what they mean. But yeah, so how did you make her, because I thought it was really interesting that I found her really admirable in your book, but it wasn't like, she wasn't a saint, it wasn't hero worship, it was a real person. And so was there a risk of that too? You're making this person that a lot of us really admire. I mean, I was really a big fan, so I was disappointed, like we all were, but because my wife is a journalist and covered Hillary for a while, and so I'd known a bunch of stuff about her for years, like that she was religious and didn't want to talk about it, and was really moved by civil rights really early. So I just admired her for a long time, and so I thought it would be hard to write a book about someone you admire that much without making her a one-dimensional person.
It's really interesting and refreshing to hear you say all this, because so if I'm talking to a journalist, the way that they might ask a similar question, it's a journalist would almost never say, well, she's so admired. They would almost always say she's so polarizing, she's so controversial, which is obviously a euphemism for saying a lot of people don't like her. And then meanwhile, if I were speaking to like a book club, especially of all women, which is, 95% of the book clubs I've ever met in the last 15 years, a lot of them might be like, oh, I love Hillary. Of course I like, like, or like lots of people have said to me like, oh, I was crying at the end of the book. But so it's actually, I mean, it's a pleasure to be asked in a sort of almost like professional or official capacity to almost be talking on the assumption that she's admirable, which I think she is admirable, and I did not want to make her saintly, just because, I mean, I feel like no one I know is saintly in real life, like no human. I mean, there's maybe there's like 2 or 3 people I've met. I wouldn't even say that they're saintly, but I would say they're like very good. But the great majority of people, and especially, I mean, even like people will talk about Biden, who, I think has made mistakes in his career. And I'll think, oh my God, I'm so much younger than Biden. And I've made probably the same number, I mean, different mistakes, but like who hasn't? Like how can we expect political figures to be perfect when none of us are perfect? So it just, I mean, almost if somebody could prove to me that Hillary was saintly, that also would have prevented me from writing the book, because I just wouldn't want to. I mean, it's almost like, who wants to have a saintly friend? Not me. Like who wants to have a saintly protagonist?
Certainly not a protagonist.
Also not me.
Maybe a saintly partner of some kind. But yeah, no, it's really interesting. But, and then we'll move off this topic, but I think she's polarizing among women too. Like the people I know who dislike her the most are some people of my mom's generation, women I know, who just really didn't like her, and I never understood why.
Well,
Passion.
So, I mean, I do feel that there has been like essentially a sort of 30-year negative PR campaign against her. And I'll think to myself, okay, like if my neighbor, like Jane, like once a week for 2 years, not even for 30 years, but for 2 years, told me horrible things about my other neighbor, like Samantha, it gets to you. Like it is very hard to constantly hear terrible things about someone and totally disregard them. So maybe you disregard them 90%, 70%, or not at all. And so I think that I think people have seen her so much as a symbol instead of like as an individual. But I think that it's not by accident, like that she ends up being a sort of stand-in for some people's ambivalence about gender and female ambition and women's, changing roles in their careers.
Yeah. Since we're before a lot of MFA students and other writers, I wanted to ask a couple of nuts and bolts questions. In terms of research, how do you craft a narrative out of someone who's so famous? I mean, we talked about that a little bit, but just in terms of actually getting down to it and saying, okay, I'm going to read this number of books or watch this number of documentaries, or was it like, I know her so well because she's part of the air we breathe that I'm just going to start?
So it's funny because I think I had read her autobiography, Living History, in 2000, probably 6 or 7, when I wrote my Laura Bush book, just as sort of background. So I think when I started the book, I felt like there's enough of her in the air that I breathe that I can just start. And very quickly I was like, no, actually I can't, like I need more backstory. And there's a biography by Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein that I read that's called A Woman in Charge. There's a really great sort of quasi memoir by Amy Chozick, a journalist for the New York Times, called Chasing Hillary, that's about reporting on Hillary off and on for like a long time, including through the 2016 campaign. Of course, I read What Happened when it came out. I read the first 250 pages of Bill Clinton's 1,000-page memoir, but then after they got married, I stopped. I mean, I think and it was actually fascinating. Like there wasn't, if I had all the time in the world, maybe I would have finished it. Maybe I someday still will. But I mean, I think the research took a few forms, or I had a few approaches, where I one time years and years ago heard the novelist Mona Simpson say that she writes up to the point when she knows kind of what research she needs to do. So like if I were, it's no spoiler to say my Hillary goes into politics. And if I were showing a scene where let's say she's running for Senate and she's in a van with some staffers. And so I would think to myself, okay, who is in the van with her in that moment? And I would think, okay, where can I find that information? Or like, how does a junior staffer, like if she's elected senator, how does a junior staffer address her? Does the person say Hillary? Do they say ma'am? Do they say, something else in between? So some of it was like kind of, trial and error, or like writing and then thinking, okay, I need to do research before I can even start writing the scene, or I can like leave a few places blank.
Right. We have a couple of questions here. Lisa Gerard, who works at the department and is a very good young writer, says, thank you so much for being here with us. My favorite academic event of the year here at NYU is when David Lipsky teaches prep in his MFA class. Prep and your book since have become the dependable preparatory reading I turn to when I write or when I can't. What books and or writers have served you best as a writer?
Oh, well, my all-time favorite writer is definitely Alice Munro, who I think of as a sort of writer's writer. Are you an Alice Munro?
Yeah, I think she's so good at scene that sometimes if I need to remind myself like how to dramatize something, I'll check her out again. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's funny because I actually, I think that the first time I ever did this was for Rodham, that I started listening to audio books sort of as research, and instead of like taking notes, I mean, I would just be kind of like usually walking around. And so in a weird way, it's almost like you only remember what you remember, especially if you're middle-aged and you don't, instead of like consciously taking notes. And I also like, I listened to the memoirs of like the women who ran for president, the female senators who ran for president in the most recent election, Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris. But it was funny because I just recently, like I listened to, so anyway, so I often listen to nonfiction. It's kind of like research for the fiction I'm trying to write. And then I read fiction at night, usually before bed. And I don't like listening to audio fiction because I think I like to, like see the layout on the page and see the punctuation, all those like thrilling things when you're a writer. But this morning I listened, and there was something I wanted to listen to that was fiction instead of listening to, it was just like a short story. And I then felt almost weird going into my own fiction that I'm trying to write. And I think there might be, for me, like I would never be a person who would be able to give up reading fiction while I'm writing a novel. But I think that maybe it's useful to me to listen to nonfiction before I enter my own fictional world, because it's kind of like, in the orbit of what I'm interested in, but it's not so close that like, I think, I don't know, like, yeah, I get, that's a kind of whatever rambling answer, but I hope that answers your question.
Let's see, we have a question from Mara Sandroff, who says, hi Curtis, thank you so much for being here. I've admired your writing for some time. Earlier today, you talked about the importance of sometimes letting the dust settle and it being difficult to write about events as they happen. With Rodham, though, not much time has passed, and so was that, was that hard?
Um, yes, I mean, I did. Like, I actually have a little bit of a personal, like, it's almost more than it's an artistic aversion. It's almost like nervousness or superstitiousness about writing into the near future. So like if a novel started in 2020, I would feel nervous writing up to like 2024 if the novel was going to come out in 2022. So the end of Rodham is 2015 basically, even, and then it was published in 2020. So I was fairly comfortable with that, but it was a strange experience to write it. And there were times where, I don't know, I'm sort of fascinated by how, like a piece of writing, whether it's fiction or an article, feels so different. Like the article itself or the fiction itself stays the same, but the world changes. So obviously, like if one of us were to look at a magazine, like say People magazine, and Donald Trump was on the cover, and the magazine was from like 1997, it would look so weird. Then it's so different and have such different connotations than it looked in 1997. And so I would read articles, this is like in 2018, say, I would read articles about the 2016 election that had been written in the summer or fall of 2016, where the tone of them was so clearly, it was sort of like, yeah, like, Hillary's not that great. She is going to win, but like, these are the things that kind of annoy her. Like, how in some families, the family members are like mean to the mom and you don't know why. It's like like the sort of, or like taking her for granted or something. Like that's what the tone felt like oh god, like over prepared Hillary, like she's so annoying with her kind of squeaky
Should have been
voice.
so prepared for the pandemic. That'd been so annoying.
Yeah. Like she thinks she's so smart when she reads those briefing books. So it was a weird thing. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm answering that question satisfyingly, but like
No,
it was strange. It was strange.
Marco K asks, do you read reviews of your books? And if so, were you surprised by your reaction to this one? And do you learn anything from reviews that you take to your next book?
So I wish that I didn't read reviews, because I think that's very dignified when writers don't. And I totally
really not do that. I mean, I don't believe.
Oh yeah, I think that people, I think some writers are too fragile and they know that about themselves, which I respect. And then I think I'm not sure anyone.
I know that about myself too, but I can't. I'm going to be in the New York Times. It's how do you not?
Well, especially, I mean, I feel like, and again, it's like I want to be like, no, I've never read a review. Like maybe you could summarize what they were, but like especially like early on, I'll read anything. Like it can be like the most, grammatically incorrect. Like it could be like a person who's like, stay away from this if you voted for Trump, or like something that like I'd be like, ha ha. Like, but like, I'll read like the first through the 9th Goodreads review, and then like by the 1200th, like I haven't been reading them for a while or whatever. And as you're saying, I mean, it's like the New York Times, of course I'm going to read it. So I was surprised by that. I think truthfully, the reviews of this were very mixed, and usually not within I mean, some were very positive, some were like scathingly, mockingly negative, and then some were in between. But I think that the book is polarizing. I mean, I think that I mean, something that was like a little bit interesting that I hadn't fully experienced is that, there was like an article that was sort of about the book, and then it was in the New York Times, like Frank Bruni wrote a column, and then in the comments were all like Benghazi, like they had nothing to do with a novel, including the novel I had written. So sometimes things would kind of like it was almost like instead of reviewing the book, people would be kind of grappling with their own Hillary feelings. Um, but I think I have been influenced by some reviews at times, and there also are times when I think like some someone recently, I don't think I've said this, like, so it might come out sounding much smaller than I mean it to. Like someone said something like, oh, for many of your books, you've like borrowed stories from kind of existing, for whether it's like Eligible is, based on Pride and Prejudice, and American Wife is based on Laura Bush, and almost like, don't you have any original ideas? And I thought to myself, like, oh, I totally have original idea, like, oh, please, like what I'm doing is harder. Like this is like, and I'm challenging myself, but like, oh, you just want me to write like a regular novel. Of course I can do. So there is something like it's a little bit like, feels misunderstood, even though in the sort of I don't know, like if I step back and have any perspective, I feel extraordinarily lucky. And yeah, I mean, I don't, do you read, do you read reviews besides in the New York Times?
I don't read Goodreads or Amazon reviews. I'll read the real, that sounds kind of saying. I'll read the ones in the newspapers and magazines.
By professional critics.
Right. But I'm sure you feel this way a little bit too. Once you're like 5, 6 books into your career, it's like I get bummed now for like what it's going to mean professionally if it gets a bad review. I don't think, oh my God, I can't write if I get a bad review. Like I feel like I know what I can do. So it's not like I'll go back to the drawing board if I get a bad review and I'll remake my entire craft. I'll just be like, oh, well, that sucks. That means that won't sell as well this week or whatever.
That's a very good point. That like I mean, I think that my main reaction, which again might be incredibly arrogant on my part, is when I get a bad review, I think like, oh, you weren't the right reader, or like, oh, you misunderstood my intent, because I totally achieved what I was trying to pull off. Maybe that wasn't like your cup of tea, but
right.
But I'm just like,
we're gonna leave here with far fewer fans than when we.
But like so much closer to each other.
But well, Tom Healy has a great question. Could you imagine a Melania novel?
Oh, no. So this is totally like sincere. Like I'm not being sarcastic. Like, to write a Melania novel is to spend, in my case, like say 2 or 3 years imagining what it's like to be married to the person Melania is married to. And it's like, I would never choose to do that. Like he has occupied, more of my brain than like I ever would have wanted already. And so I would, I mean, we choose to some extent as fiction writers, we choose the fictional reality we live in. And I would never seek that out.
Someone asks, it's a great answer. Someone asks, what's your favorite book or short story and how has it influenced your writing?
I mean, so probably my favorite books are the various Alice Munro collections. Like I think there's different stories in different collections. Like if I were to make a list of my favorite stories, it would probably be like 2 in Open Secrets, and then 2 in like Friendship, Hate Ship, Love Ship. I think Open Secrets might be, and then The Love of a Good Woman. Like I think that Alice Munro seems like she's had, I mean, I think she's a very consistent writer, but I think the sort of stage of what she was writing about, and like maybe in the early 2000s or something, I felt like it was like those stories to me are really kind of perfect, and the really like ambitious epic short stories that are 50 pages long and they're so complicated, and they're not afraid to make the reader work a little bit, or like almost like you have to get all the way to the end to understand the plot, and then you can kind of go back, but along the way there's been like these brilliant insights about human nature, and I also think she's so sophisticated about sort of not expecting character, like almost understanding, like, of course people are flawed, of course people are sometimes like greedy, of course people betray each other, and like almost like not over explaining. So everything she does to me is just so like, wise and deft, and like doesn't look like she's breaking a sweat. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think my favorite of hers is probably Bear Came Over the Mountain. That's just such a masterpiece.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
The way it jumps ahead.
Yeah.
They're just a college couple, and then all of a sudden they're 65, and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Yeah,
incredible.
it's like so fearless to be like, yeah, you think you're reading one story and then 50 years have passed. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I actually, I do think I've even specifically been influenced by her. And I was joking one time with an editor and saying, like, I've never met a flash forward that I don't like. Like there's something to me, it's almost like the satisfaction that attending a high school reunion provides, where if you haven't seen someone for 10 or 15 years, they don't have to have been doing anything interesting. Like just the passage of time is interesting or is a plot. And I think that she, like, there's no one who's better at kind of manipulating time or like bending it to her will than Alice Munro.
It's such a great craft lesson that I never thought of before. That is such a good plot thing. Like, yeah, just nothing interesting has to happen. You don't have to even just 15 years. Like that is such good advice, I think. Um, how do you generate story ideas, especially for short stories? Catherine asks.
Um, it's funny because I feel like I think in some ways my advice would be like, I write a novel and then or like I say I'll turn in a novel at a certain time, and then all I do is have story ideas and want to write them, which I think, like, of all the ways, that one could like procrastinate on writing a novel, that's not the worst. But I think just like going through life, and it's funny. So around the same time, I read the book, the novel Asymmetry by, is it Lisa Halliday, I think. And then I read the nonfiction, or like actually sort of, maybe it's autofiction. I'm not even sure how it's classified, but is it Motherhood by Sheila Heti? And they both had these passages that I was so fascinated by, where they were kind of like throwaway passages, not central passages, but they both said something like, in order to create art or like be creatively productive, you need these ingredients, and both of them, boredom was one of them. And I will say, like, like, I don't think I lead a life, like, of course it's such a treat to do something like this, but like on a daily basis, my life is like going to the grocery store and living in what looks like, I think I technically live in the city of Minneapolis, but like what looks like the suburbs. And um it's almost like my own, I mean, now obviously everyone's lives are like upended, but I think I just feel like existing in a normal way, like not as a writer and not talking about writing. I feel like the press of sort of human nature, and I also don't know if this is like a writer thing, but in some ways, one of the interesting parts about getting older is that I feel like I've heard more and more almost like shocking or somewhat shocking confession. Like, do you think this, Darin? Like, like you just know people and surprising things happen to them as the years pass. And so I feel like in some ways stories, they come from everywhere.
Yeah, no, that's really, really well said. And I think boredom is a sort of an ignored important thing for the brain, right? Like I think we're inundated with jabs all the time from everywhere. And I think that you can't think, literature is such a quiet practice, such a what's the word, like a slow patience, that
Yeah.
it's hard to square with Twitter and
Yeah.
Facebook.
But actually, one thing I will say, that I mean, one, I think that I have an unhealthy relationship with my phone, like most people, and I do have some limit. So it's like I'm I do feel like if I look at Twitter in the morning, especially like it's almost like I'm okay if I look at it when I wake up, even though that's bad in its own way. And then like kind of get through my morning routine and then write. But if I look at it and then try to write fiction, it's like Twitter has hijacked my brain.
Yeah.
I think that's almost like the probably the single daily decision that I can make is like don't look at Twitter before fiction. Like don't.
Good advice. Oh, let's do one more question because it's 8 o'clock. So this is from Billy Pepicelli. Super thanks, Curtis. When you're working on a novel and you're stuck, what's your antidote to that? Do you ever switch gears and work on something different? I once heard you give reading at Brookline Booksmith where you said that you spend so much time revising that if someone were to read out loud a line from a story, you could almost certainly get the line that came before it and or after it. Does the same hold true for your novels? Are you prepared to be put to the test? No, let's not do that test. But yeah,
Well, sometimes we'll do that. That might not be interesting for anyone. By the way, also, like I feel like if you write a novel, like it's like a sort of like the city you live in versus the city you used to live in, and so there is a time I actually could probably do that with a novel at the time it's published. And then the months pass and it's like, you forget the streets of like the city that you used to live in. And I actually am writing another novel. And so I think that is the city that I live in right now. I mean, if I guess that when I am writing, especially if I'm writing, I think a novel or a short story, and I'm like really not feeling it. I mean, one thing is there are things that I can do or not do to try to like make it easier for me to write, even if it's like cleaning my desk the day before or not looking at Twitter or whatever to try to make it easier. But if I'm sort of trying to focus in a good faith way, and another thing is, this is so like dumb and nitty gritty, but it's like if you have the impulse to like do something, like it's like write it down on a piece of paper, don't get up and whether it's like put the trash out or respond to an email or whatever, just like make a note to yourself to do it. But sometimes I'll say, okay, I've just like gotten lost or gotten discouraged within this one scene, and so I'm going to go on to another scene, especially one that's like appealing to me. And I also outline, and sometimes I'll even take a day and instead of writing new scenes, I'll revise my outline to like bring it up to date. Or I feel like I almost could show you. This is probably a bad idea. Nobody use a nobody take a picture of this, not to flatter myself, but like this is an outline that you can see, and it's like I almost have to revise my outlines because I'm sort of constantly having this conversation with myself.
I think such an interesting thing about the city for me, and tell me if this is true for you. I feel like it takes me a long time. It's almost like moving to a city. I know the book is close to being done when I actually can see the different streets. Like for a long time, I'm like, I don't know where stuff is, and I'll write something and I'll forget that it contradicts something from the past. I'll write a whole chapter and I'll be like, oh wait, that doesn't make sense with what I wrote in chapter 1. But then something clicks at some point, and then you see a line in chapter 20, and you're like, oh, that corresponds to the line in chapter 1. And once you get that sense, it's like a map of the city opens up for you, and that's when I know I have it.
Yeah, I totally feel it's almost like when you have lived somewhere long enough that you can like make a shortcut that no one told you, like you just figured it out on your own by your instincts. Yeah, I totally feel that way.
I think maybe that's a good spot to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Curtis, for taking the time. It was really great to see you as always, and thanks everyone for listening. And please check out Rodham and whatever your next book is.
And the Queen of Tuesday. Thank you, Darin. Thank you for asking such smart, thoughtful questions, and thank you all of you. I'm sure that all of you look at screens too much, so thank you for voluntarily looking at a screen even more. This was so fun.
Really is great. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye, Curtis. Bye, Joanna.